Joining us now, haven't heard from him in a while. He's been overseas. Former governor of Virginia, FOJ, friend of John, Jim Gilmore. Now, he's in Vienna. He's in the Trump administration. And he's been tough to get on because, it's big time difference and all that good stuff. And he is the United States ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The call letters for that, the acronym OSCE. Now, this was actually started in 1975 after then USSR Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev and President Ford signed the Helsinki Accords. This is a very important, very delicate post, and this has been given 2 years ago to Governor Jim Gilmore, former governor of Virginia, and he is now in the Trump administration. He sailed through Senate confirmation, and he's back in the States now with Roxanne, his lovely bride and the former First Lady, and he's with us now. I can now call you Ambassador Gilmore. Ambassador, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with you. I guess you can call me that. It's still me.
I know, Ambassador Jim Gilmore, right? Who would have ever thought? Governor, ambassador, ran for president. We're so honored to have you on. So you're in Vienna. You're in Austria. Tell me exactly what your function is and what you're working on now.
Well, very good. Well, first of all, I'm sure that none of the listeners have really heard of OSCE. It's not well known in the United States, but the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is a very large organization. It's basically the United Nations for the Northern Hemisphere. Everybody in Europe is in it, all the way from Norway all the way down to Turkey. Everybody's in it. Russia is in it. Ukraine is in it. It has countries in Central Asia that are in it. And it's dedicated based on that 1975 Helsinki Accords to trying to create some stability, trying to create some sense of lack of war or trying to prevent a war in Europe. Almost all the major world wars that have ever happened has killed millions of people, and Americans too, and it starts in Europe. Mm-hmm. And the goal here was to try to extend Western values, to try to stand for human rights, to try to create some military operations that would create some stability and prevent war in Europe. And that's what it is. And I am the ambassador, the United States ambassador to this organization. So there are 57 countries. There's an ambassador for each country in the OSCE. We meet once a week in the Permanent Council in a historic building called the Hofburg in downtown Vienna. Your guys and gals can look it up on the Internet. It used to be the Habsburgs' major home in downtown Vienna. It's now converted into a public building, and OSCE meets there. The goal here is, to try to create some sense of military stability. So there is an advocacy for notification of any types of exercises that are going to go on. There's economic issues. There are human rights issues. But really, John, what's going on right now, honestly, is that your listeners need to understand that things have changed in Europe and they've changed in the world. This is no longer a stable world. This is an unstable, very dangerous world. Europe is very dangerous. I like to say that we're fighting the battle over there, and we are. I confront the Russians every week at the Permanent Council meeting and stand up for the Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. I'm carrying out President Trump's foreign policy, which is to be strong, to stand up, to stand for for Ukrainian sovereignty, and to deal with this revisionist power that's the Russians that are trying to change everything around. So I'm doing all of that, and I'm representing the United States in doing it, and I'm proud to have a chance to represent President Trump in Europe.
What is your main objective now when you say you're dealing, Ambassador Gilmore, with the Russians? What is it that they're trying to change? And as the U.S. ambassador to this organization, what are you doing to actually mitigate that?
It's to leverage the organization, the 57 countries, to build up our relations with our allies. I work very closely with the Germans, the French, the British, and all of the other allies that we are developing. You need to recognize that our allies need to know that the United States is there, that we're present, that we're going to be there, that they're not alone in dealing with the Russians. It's a diplomatic effort to reassure our allies, to take all of the central countries that are trying to figure out which way they're going to go and make sure they know that there's an American presence there, to deal with the ongoing wars and conflicts that are going on in Europe right now, starting with Ukraine, but also Georgia, Moldova. There are additional conflicts that don't have anything to do with the Russians, and these are real shooting wars that are going on, John. And then, we have to deal with the Ukrainian issue and the Russians. And the Russians are pushing all the time. This is a consensus organization. They're very active in the organization. They're increasing their activity in the organization because they think they can use it as a vehicle for their goals. Their goals are expansion, the expansion of their sphere of influence, and maybe their actual expansion the way they've done in the past. The American goal here and our allies is to not let that happen, to keep Europe free and to keep Europe stable so that we don't end up in another war. Although you read the headlines every day, you can see the simmering danger that's really going on over there and here too.
Define their expansionist goals. I mean, obviously, we understand their objective with Crimea. Might not agree with it, but understand it. Syria, they've been an ally of the USSR, now the Russian Federation since the Second World War. It's their only warm water port they have. So beyond Syria, Crimea, Ukraine, when you say you're battling Russian expansionism, what is, in your mind, what is their goal?
Well, let's talk about it. The whole point of the Helsinki Accords, and you can look those up too, they're on the Internet. The whole Helsinki Accords said you're not going to end up conquering other countries and changing borders by military action. That's the agreement that was reached in 1975 and what people have been living under. The Russians have violated that. Mm-hmm. They have not only put troops into Georgia, they have put troops into Moldova, but they have also, most importantly, put troops into eastern Ukraine. And this effort to annex the Crimea, I don't care what the history is, the problem is that's changing borders by military action. Mm-hmm. Well, that's illegal. It's improper. They're using terrible methods in the Crimea. They're arresting people who don't agree with them. They're sending them to gulags. There's terrible human rights violations that are going on. And the point is, these are the principles now that the Russians are trying to establish, not only for Europe, but for the world. And you can't permit that to happen. The United States has to be there with our allies to push back on that kind of thing. And that's what we're doing with the Russian efforts to expand. This very morning, there's a headline that says that they're trying to create some kind of agreement with Belarus, for example, to try to combine those countries back again. So there's the agreement that was reached years ago to create some understanding between Russia and the West has disintegrated. It's broken down, and now the goal here is to stop their Russian expansion at the same time trying to prevent a war. Because if you get into a shooting war with the Russians, anything goes.
So we're with Ambassador Jim Gilmore, and Ambassador, so when you say pushback, just give me like one specific example so our audience can really grasp here what you're saying. On any given day, what Ambassador Gilmore would do as part of the Russian expansionism pushback as ambassador for the U.S. to this organization? Like, well, what would you specifically do?
So let me tell you two things. One that's easily understood. The United States has, in fact, supported Ukraine's sovereignty. President Trump has done what the previous presidents have not done. He's actually provided real military weaponry to the Ukrainians, and people can get that. They understand that when you provide weaponry to a country that's got its own army and trying to remain independent, people can get that. What's harder to understand is the role of diplomacy. When the American ambassador goes into a 57-country council and is speaking directly, not just to the Russians who are across the table, but to the Ukrainians who are at the table, to our allies who are at the table, to other countries, the other 57 countries, and we pronounce American statements, we're communicating. Don't take further types of actions, military or otherwise, because you can create something that's dangerous from the United States point of view. So this ambassador is there constantly putting out exactly the red lines that the United States wants everybody to understand. And that kind of communication is important. Diplomacy is important. You see in the headlines all the time that heads of states are meeting together, their foreign ministers are meeting together, their ambassadors are meeting, in order to try to create some understanding of how far people can go and how far they can't. And of course, the whole goal of the OSCE is to promote liberty and democracy and freedom, not only across Europe but across the world. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're doing.
We're with former governor of Virginia, now Ambassador Jim Gilmore. He is based in Vienna, Austria. He's a Trump administration appointee ambassador, confirmed by the U.S. Senate. He's ambassador now to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, started in 1975 in the Helsinki Accords. Ambassador Gilmore, now I'm understanding exactly what your role is. Tell us about your relationship with President Trump and your communication with him, Mulvaney, others, because when you talk, and obviously your boss, Mike Pompeo, when you talk about these are red lines, right? Of course, now when we think of a red line, everybody thinks of Obama's Syrian red line that we never did anything. So, two-part question, but let me start with the first. Your relationship with the President Pompeo, tell us about that.
Well, I'm certainly not going to overstate this, but the president certainly had confidence in me, or he never would have appointed me. Mm-hmm. And he understands who I am. We were in politics together, as you know. So the president is well aware of who I am, or he never would have made the appointment. Mm-hmm. I had a very nice meeting with him in the Oval Office before I went to Europe to talk to him about some of these issues, and he gave me his thoughts about European policy very quickly, of course, but still, nonetheless, he did. However, what needs to be understood is that there's a constant communication going on between the White House and the Department of State. And the ambassadors work within and report within the bureaus of the Department of State. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, my direct boss, the guy who appointed me and who could fire me, is the President of the United States. Mm-hmm. So we try to keep everybody informed through all these channels as to everything that we're doing for American policy. But John, this is a really big appointment. I told him before I ever considered serving in the United States government, I said, I'm not interested in something that's going to be ceremonial. Mm-hmm. I want to actually get in there, get my hands dirty, and try to actually help the United States. Mm-hmm. And so they said, okay, get a load of this, and they appointed me to the OSCE, and I'm telling you, it's a very, very significant post, and I'm delighted to be residing in Vienna.
And so when you're at one of the meetings with the 57 other ambassadors representing the United States, and you make, in no uncertain terms, a clarity of red lines that the United States are not going to tolerate without consequence, based on our experience with Obama's red line, President Obama, that didn't really exist, you're confident that when you make those statements, you have the full authority of the White House behind you, and they have real meaning, right?
Yep. And furthermore, I think that both our friends and adversaries around the world, you hear a lot of disinformation about how European countries are uncertain of America, and they're mad with President Trump, and everything's coming to pieces. That is not my experience in Vienna. Mm-hmm. The United States is well respected. The American ambassador is well respected. And I work pretty hard, though, to keep those relationships going. We have constant relationship meetings. You're describing the Permanent Council meeting, which meets every week at the Hofburg. It's very formal. All 57 countries' ambassadors are around the table with their countries' names in front of them, and we debate these issues and hear the reports and make the statements. Every week, under the supervision of the Secretary of State, we make a very firm statement regarding the Ukraine. Now, why do we do this, John? Because it's international politics. Mm-hmm. If the Russians can take the position that they're entitled to control everything where there are Russian speakers, if they say, well, this is true for eastern Ukraine, so we ought to be able to annex that, or the Crimea, we ought to be able to annex that, then you have to watch out, because there's a lot of Russian speakers, for example, in the Baltic countries.
Right, Latvia, Estonia.
Especially Estonia, who are they have their ambassador there, and they're obviously watching all this very closely, but their independence is at stake. Mm-hmm. And if the Russians can basically take that political philosophy and back it up with troops, then they may invade Estonia. And, John, if they do that, that's game on, mm-hmm. because Estonia is a member of NATO, and the United States has drawn a line of support for the Baltic countries, the mm-hmm. independence and freedom of the Baltic countries. So there's a lot of tripwires there in Europe right now that we're paying attention to.
Well, it's interesting, and as you say, I mean, the Baltic states, Estonia especially, is a Russian-speaking country, they have to be very wary about what they're saying. You know, it's interesting. I got to tell you, we have listeners all over the world. I just got an email from a Professor Ladvig in Finland who wants to ask you a question. This is in Eastern Finland, listening to us now. I'm not sure what time it is out there, but Professor Lidbig says, can you ask the ambassador how Finland fits into this, and what is your relationship with the Finnish ambassador there?
And the answer directly is the Finns are very important. The Finns are the president of the European Union. Now, the Russians have made it clear that they consider to be their adversaries in their new aggressive policy. Their adversaries are NATO, the United States, and the European Union. Mm-hmm. Finland is not a member of NATO, but they are the president of the European Union. I meet with the Finnish ambassador every week together with the European Union representative. The two of them meet with the United States ambassador, who is me, and we discuss our joint policy and our ability to coordinate things in order to preserve these values that we've been discussing. Pave is her name. She's a very successful woman, ambassador. She does very, very well and is quite a leader. So Finland can be very proud of the role that they're playing in Europe and the role that they're playing in all of the Western alliances. And I must say this. I've told people that I've been very surprised since I got to Europe. And I've told people that the two things that have surprised me the most is how good the Swedes and the Finns really are and how dangerous the Balkans are. Mm-hmm. And we could, of course, that's a whole new topic we could talk about down there with Albania and Serbia and all that. But the professor can be assured that Finland is playing a pretty key role, really, for a country that's on the periphery of Europe, but is actually making themselves very central in European policy.
All right, so we have to get you back next week before you go back to Vienna with Roxanne to talk about the Balkans. I'm almost out of time. I just got two more quick questions. President Trump's America First policy agenda, especially as it relates to foreign policy, how is that going over with the OSCE members?
Well, it's the American. It's my job to explain what we really mean here. And what the president has really said is that he's tired of a foreign policy that is disrespectful of the American people, that doesn't stand up for the American people, doesn't take the American people into consideration first. And I can follow that policy just fine. I do follow that policy just fine. But that doesn't mean that we've got to be isolationist and not have any friends anywhere in the world. We do have friends in the world, and frankly, we're in the global conflict, John. We're in a global conflict. Hybrid warfare is going on right now, which is a conflict containing all the elements of national power, economics, cyber, military, messaging. All of this is going on right now. We don't want to do this all by ourselves, and we're not alone. The Russians are pretty isolated. They have very few allies, but we have lots of allies. It's my job to make sure, at least in the OSCE, that people are confident of American leadership and President Trump's foreign policy, and I'm doing that.
Very educational today. I have a much better understanding of exactly what you do, and thank you, sir.
Well, keep up the good work. One of these days, you and I will be able to talk about real politics again, but today is not that day, but I'm watching everything that you're saying. You keep up the good work.
I understand, sir. I know the rules, as you know, very, very well. Ambassador Jim Gilmore, thanks for being with us. To you, Roxanne, and your family, a very Merry Christmas, sir.